started with a simple challenge. Someone typed a question into Grok, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence system, and asked it to do something that thousands of skeptics, scholars, and critics have tried to do for centuries. Find the contradictions in the Bible. Not summarize it, not explain it. Find the cracks. Find the places where the book breaks under its own weight. Grok was built for exactly this kind of task. It was designed to be blunt, unfiltered, and logical. A machine that doesn't flatter, doesn't dodge, and doesn't care whose feelings get hurt along the way. If any system was going to rip apart an ancient religious text with cold, mechanical precision, it should have been this one. So when the answer came back, nobody expected what they got. Instead of a takedown, Grok produced something closer to a map of patterns, of structure, of connections between books written by different authors in different languages, across different centuries, that somehow still lined up in ways that made even the engineers pause. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what Grok actually is. Grok was developed by Elon Musk's company, XAI, and launched in late 2023 as a direct answer to ChatGPT and the other major language models flooding the market. But Grok was never meant to be just another chatbot. Musk wanted something different, an AI with personality, with humor, with an edge, something willing to say things other models were trained to avoid. It was also built with a unique advantage, real-time access to information through X, formerly known as Twitter. While other models were frozen in time, limited to whatever data they were trained on, Grok could reach into the present moment. It could see what people were saying right now, pull in fresh context, and respond with an awareness that felt less like a static encyclopedia and more like a living conversation partner. This mattered for the Bible question, because it meant Grok wasn't just repeating old apologetics or reciting a canned Sunday school answer. It was working the problem in real time, the same way it would analyze a stock chart, a legal document, or a coding error. And the Bible, from a purely technical standpoint, looks like an enormous target for contradictions. It was written by dozens of different authors, over a period spanning more than 1,000 years, in at least 3 different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, across wildly different genres: law, poetry, prophecy, letters, historical narrative, apocalyptic vision. It was assembled, translated, copied by hand for centuries, and eventually bound into the single volume most people picture when they hear the word Bible. If you wanted to build the perfect test case for an AI hunting inconsistencies, this would be it. So the question went in: find the contradictions. And what came back wasn't a list of errors. It was something closer to an argument for design. Before Grok got into specifics, it did something interesting. It stopped and defined its terms. Most people, when they think of a contradiction, picture something simple. One line says, "The sky is blue." Another line says, "The sky is green." That's a contradiction, a direct NO, clash between 2 claims that cannot both be true at the same time. But Grok pointed out that this is a very narrow definition, and it doesn't hold up well against ancient historical texts, especially ones with multiple human authors writing from different vantage points. Think about it this way. If 4 different witnesses describe a car accident, one might remember the color of the car. Another might remember the sound of the crash. A third might recall what a bystander shouted. A fourth might focus entirely on how fast the vehicles were moving. None of them are lying. None of them are wrong. They're just reporting the same event through the lens of their own attention, memory, and position at the scene. If you compared their 4 statements side by side, you'd find differences, gaps, details that don't perfectly overlap. A prosecutor might even call some of those differences inconsistent. But any actual investigator will tell you the opposite is true. When 4 witness statements match up too perfectly, word for word, detail for detail, that's the red flag. That's when you start suspecting collusion, a rehearsed story, or fabrication. Real independent testimony almost always includes small variations. It's the natural fingerprint of authentic experience. Grok applied this exact logic to the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 different authors, writing at different times for different audiences with different purposes, describing the same central events in the life of a man they claimed to have, either witnessed directly or received first-hand accounts from those who did. And yes, there are differences between their accounts: the order of certain events, the specific wording of certain sayings, which details get emphasized and which get left out. But instead of treating those differences as fatal flaws, Grok framed them the way a modern investigator would frame witness testimony, as a sign of authenticity, not fabrication. Independent accounts of a real event almost never match perfectly. It's when they match too perfectly that you should start asking questions. This alone reframed the entire conversation. The very thing skeptics have used for centuries as ammunition against the Bible, the differences between the gospel accounts, Grok flipped into evidence for their credibility. Grok went further and broke down a handful of the most commonly cited contradictions people bring up when they want to challenge the Bible's reliability. the order of events during the resurrection morning, the exact wording of the inscription on the cross, the number of angels present at the tomb in different gospel accounts. Each one taken in isolation and read the way a lawyer might. Cross-examine a hostile witness looks like a discrepancy. But Grok kept returning to the same underlying logic. Ancient authors were not writing court transcripts. They weren't attempting word-for-word photographic documentation the way a modern news report might. They were writing theological narratives, shaped by memory, audience, and purpose, in a culture where oral tradition and selective emphasis were the norm rather than the exception. Leaving out a detail wasn't the same as denying it. Emphasizing a different angle wasn't the same as contradicting the other author. Grok compared this to the way 4 different news outlets might cover the same press conference today. One outlet leads with the economic angle. Another leads with a controversial quote. A third focuses on audience reaction. A fourth barely mentions the quote everyone else focused on. None of these outlets are lying to their readers. They're just filtering the same event through a different lens, a different set of priorities, a different intended audience. That's not contradiction. That's simply how human reporting, ancient or modern, actually works. But Grok didn't stop at witness testimony. It kept digging, and what it found next is where things get genuinely strange, even to people who aren't especially religious. It started tracking literary patterns across the entire text, patterns that show up not just within individual books, but across the whole collection, connecting authors who had no possible way of coordinating with each other. And one of the patterns it highlighted was something called chiasmus, a mirrored literary structure where ideas are presented in a sequence, then repeated in reverse order, creating a kind of symmetrical shape when you map it out. Think A, B, C, then C, B, A. This isn't a modern literary trick. It shows up throughout ancient Hebrew poetry, in the Psalms, in the prophetic books, even embedded in individual sentences. It's a structure so precise that scholars have spent entire careers mapping where it appears and what it means. Grok noted that this structure doesn't just appear once or twice as a stylistic flourish. It recurs, at multiple scales, throughout the text. Small chiastic structures nested inside larger ones, like a fractal pattern that repeats whether you're looking at a single verse or an entire book. Then there's the numerical patterning. Certain numbers repeat throughout the text with a frequency that goes beyond coincidence, 7, 12, 40, tied to creation, tribes, judgment, testing, renewal. These aren't just recurring plot details. They function as a kind of symbolic code that threads through books written centuries apart by authors who, in most cases, never read each other's work and had no access to each other's writings. Grok also pointed to thematic echoes, promises made early in the text that get fulfilled, often in unexpected ways, much later. A sacrifice described in one book that gets mirrored, almost exactly, in imagery used centuries later by a completely different author in a completely different genre. A pattern of exile and return that shows up again and again at different scales, as if the same story keeps happening at different sizes throughout history. None of this, on its own, proves anything supernatural. Human authors can absolutely draw on shared cultural symbols, shared oral traditions, shared source material. That's not mysterious. That's how literature and religious tradition actually work. But what struck the people reviewing Grok's output wasn't any single pattern. It was the density of them. The sheer number of structural, numerical, and thematic threads running through a text assembled over more than 1,000 years by different authors in different languages that still somehow reads, at a structural level, like something closer to a single, coherent, layered piece of work than a loose anthology of unrelated fragments. Grok also touched on something a little more technical, the way certain Hebrew word roots recur across completely different books, tying together concepts that don't look connected in translation but share a linguistic root in the original language. A word used to describe a garden in Genesis reappears in root form centuries later in a prophetic vision, describing restoration. A word tied to covenant in one book echoes forward into legal and poetic texts written long after the original author was gone. Translators, working across different eras and different target languages, don't always preserve those linguistic threads, which means most readers encountering the text in English or any other translation never even see them. This is part of why Grok's analysis felt different from a typical devotional argument. It wasn't leaning on emotional appeals or theological assertions. It was pointing at something closer to structural engineering, word roots, narrative symmetry, numeric recurrence, the kind of pattern detection a machine is actually built to notice, the same way it might flag a repeating sequence in a genome or a recurring motif in a piece of music. And that's precisely why the response landed the way it did. People weren't just reading a defense of the Bible. They were watching a system built for cold pattern recognition find more structure than noise in a text that critics have spent centuries describing as a disorganized patchwork. When this analysis started circulating, the reaction was immediate. And it split almost exactly along the lines you'd expect. Believers pointed to it as validation. Here was a machine built purely on logic and probability, with no personal stake in the outcome, no faith commitment, no theological agenda. And it came back describing the Bible not as a flawed patchwork, but as something structurally coherent, layered, and intentional. To many, that felt like exactly the kind of outside, unbiased confirmation they'd been waiting for. Skeptics pushed back hard, and their argument deserves to be laid out fairly because it's not a weak one. An AI model doesn't independently discover truth. It's trained on human-generated data, books, essays, commentaries, articles, centuries of theological scholarship defending the coherence of Scripture. When Grok describes patterns in the Bible, it isn't reasoning from scratch. It's reflecting back patterns that human scholars have already identified and written about extensively, patterns that exist in the training data it learned from. In that view, Grok isn't discovering a hidden design. It's summarizing what apologists have argued for generations, dressed up in the language of a neutral machine. There's also a simpler explanation for at least some of the structural patterns. Humans built the canon. The books of the Bible weren't just written independently and thrown together at random. They were selected, arranged, and in some cases edited by later communities of scribes and religious authorities who were themselves looking for thematic coherence. Some of the impossible connections may not be a coincidence at all. They may be the product of careful, very human curation over centuries, not evidence of something beyond human design. Both of these are legitimate points, and any honest account of this story has to include them. But here's what actually made this moment different from a typical online religious debate. Grok didn't come down firmly on one side. It didn't declare the Bible divinely authored. It didn't declare it purely a human artifact either. It offered a framework. These patterns exist, they can be explained in multiple ways, and reasonable people, informed by logic, can land in different places. That neutrality is what genuinely surprised people. In an online environment where AI responses about religion often get flattened into either dismissive skepticism or uncritical affirmation, Grok's answer refused to pick a side, and instead asked a better question. What do you do with a text that shows this much internal structure, regardless of how you explain its origin? The response online split into a few distinct camps, and it's worth walking through each of them, because they represent the same divide that's existed around religion and science for generations, just replayed with a new participant in the conversation. The first camp treated this as a kind of modern miracle story, proof, finally, delivered by an unbiased machine, that the ancient text held up under the harshest possible scrutiny. Clips of the exchange spread quickly across religious commentary channels, framed with dramatic music and slow zooms, presented as a moment where even AI couldn't find the flaws. The second camp treated it as a case study in AI limitation, not biblical vindication. Their argument, a language model doesn't evaluate truth. It predicts likely text based on patterns in its training data. If a huge percentage of that training data consists of centuries of theology, commentary, and apologetics defending the Bible's coherence, then of course the model's output will lean in that direction. Ask it to analyze the internal consistency of any sufficiently large, culturally significant text with a long defensive tradition behind it, the argument goes, and you'll likely get a similarly balanced answer, because that's what balanced-sounding commentary about that text looks like across the internet. A third camp, smaller but worth mentioning, pointed out that this exact story, an AI being silenced or stunned by the Bible, has been recycled across dozens of videos, articles, and podcasts, often with nearly identical wording, different narrators, and vague or missing sourcing for the actual underlying conversation. To this group, the phenomenon says less about Grok specifically, and more about how quickly a compelling narrative template spreads once it starts generating engagement, regardless of how much of the specific framing can actually be verified against a real citable transcript. All three of these reactions are worth holding at once. The patterns Grok described are real and well documented by biblical scholars independent of any AI. The concern about AI simply reflecting its training data is a legitimate and important critique of how these systems work. And the viral spread of near-identical retellings of this story is its own separate, very human phenomenon, one that has more to do with how content travels online than with what any AI actually said in a single specific exchange. This is really where the story stops being about one chatbot and one ancient book and starts being about something much bigger. We are entering an era where artificial intelligence is going to be asked to weigh in on every subject humans have ever argued about, including the ones we used to think only faith, philosophy, or personal conviction could touch. History, ethics, origins, meaning, and yes, scripture. And what this moment revealed is that the line between logic and belief isn't always as clean as we assume. We like to imagine that a purely rational machine, given a purely rational task, will produce a purely rational, disenchanting answer. Feed it a religious text, and it should behave like a debunking machine, methodically stripping away mystery until nothing is left but contradiction and myth. But that's not quite what happened here. Instead, the machine ran into something it couldn't, fully reduced to error. Dense patterns, structural symmetry, thematic coherence across a huge span of time and authorship. And it reported that honestly, instead of forcing the data into a tidy, dismissive conclusion. Maybe that tells us something about the Bible. Maybe it tells us something about pattern recognition itself, and how any sufficiently large, culturally important text accumulates structure over time simply because humans keep shaping and reshaping it toward coherence. Maybe it tells us something about the limits of asking a language model trained on human writing to have an opinion about human writing in the first place. Whatever the explanation, it's clear the single exchange did something 1,000 op-eds and sermons haven't managed to do. I got skeptics, believers, engineers, and theologians, all looking at the same output, all asking the same question at the same time. What do we actually do with a book like this? There's also a broader shift happening here that goes beyond any one religious text. For most of human history, questions about meaning, morality, and origin belonged almost exclusively to philosophers, priests, and theologians. Science carved out its own territory over the last few centuries, answering questions about mechanism and process, while largely staying out of questions about ultimate meaning. Now, for the first time, we have systems that can sit at the intersection of both, trained on scientific literature and religious commentary alike, capable of being asked to weigh in on either, sometimes in the same conversation. That raises a genuinely new kind of question. When people ask an AI system to evaluate scripture, are they asking a neutral calculator, or are they asking something closer to a mirror? A system trained on the sum total of human argument about that scripture, reflecting the shape of that argument back at us? Grok's own answer, at least in how it was described, leaned toward acknowledging that mirror-like quality rather than pretending to some detached view from nowhere. Authority. It offered patterns. It offered context. It stopped short of a verdict. Maybe that restraint is the most important part of the whole story. In an online culture that constantly demands hot takes, verdicts, and viral certainty, a system explicitly designed to be blunt and unfiltered chose, in this instance, not to hand down a definitive ruling on one of humanity's oldest and most contested questions. It handed back complexity instead. There's no tidy bow to tie on this. Grok didn't prove the Bible is divinely inspired. It didn't debunk it either. What it did was harder to dismiss than either of those outcomes. It took the oldest accusation leveled against Scripture, that it's full of contradictions, and instead of confirming that accusation, it offered a more complicated, more structured, more interesting picture. Whether you walk away from this seeing evidence of intentional design, or evidence of centuries of careful human curation, or simply evidence that pattern recognition systems find patterns wherever there's enough data to find them, the conversation this sparked is the real story here. Because in the end, the question was never really about whether an AI could win an argument about the Bible. The question is what it means when logic and faith stop being opposites for a moment and start asking the same question together. Was it algorithms uncovering an ancient design, or centuries of human hands quietly building coherence into a book meant to last? Maybe the most honest answer, the one Grok itself seemed to land on, is that we don't fully know, and that not knowing might be exactly the point. It's worth remembering, too, that this wasn't the first time a text has surprised the very tools built to dissect it. Historians using computational analysis on Shakespeare's plays have found authorship patterns nobody expected. Linguists running statistical models on ancient epic poetry have uncovered structural symmetries that took centuries of careful reading to notice with the human eye. Complexity hiding in plain sight, waiting for a new kind of tool to finally make it visible, isn't unique to Scripture. It's a pattern that shows up whenever a sufficiently rich, sufficiently old body of text gets examined with a sufficiently new lens. What makes the Bible different is simply the stakes attached to it. Nobody has ever built a religion around the authorship patterns in a Shakespeare play. Nobody organizes their entire worldview around a symmetrical structure in an ancient epic. But billions of people across thousands of years have staked their sense of meaning, morality, and identity on this particular text. So when a piece of technology built purely on logic and probability comes back describing the text as more structured, more layered, and more internally coherent than expected, the reaction was never going to be small. It was always going to ripple outward into questions about faith, about truth, about what happens when the tools we built to challenge our oldest beliefs end up complicating them instead of settling them. That ripple is exactly where this conversation now lives, not in a single definitive answer, but in the discomfort and curiosity of not having one. Believers get to feel that their text held up under a new, unforgiving kind of scrutiny. Skeptics get to keep pointing out correctly that pattern recognition isn't proof, and that a system trained on human commentary will always carry the fingerprints of that commentary. And everyone else, caught somewhere in the middle, gets a rare moment where a machine, of all things, asked us to sit with uncertainty instead of rushing toward a conclusion. If this made you think, that's the goal. Not to hand you an answer, but to hand you a better question. Let us know what you think it means. And if you want more explorations like this, where technology, faith, and truth collide, stay with us. This is only the beginning of that conversation.